Adrian Holt was 38 years old when he poured a $520 bottle of Bordeaux over his wife's head in front of 180 corporate executives on the 47th floor of the Castellan Tower. And not one person in that glass-walled boardroom knew they were watching a man destroy a fortune worth more than everything he'd ever earned in his life. Liana Evans sat perfectly still in her navy sleeveless dress, her dark hair falling in elegant waves past her shoulders, her brown eyes fixed on the contracts spread across the mahogany table. The city lights glittered behind the floor-to-ceiling windows like scattered diamonds, and the room smelled of expensive cologne, leather portfolios, and ambition. She'd been sitting there for 2 hours, watching her husband sign away pieces of his soul with each flourish of his Mont Blanc pen. Adrian stood at the head of the table in his cobalt blue suit, custom-tailored at $4,200, his tie loosened, his voice carrying across the room with the confidence of a man who believed he'd finally made it. The deal before him represented a $700 million acquisition, merging his software company, Holt Innovations, with the tech giant Meridian Global. His payout alone would be $340 million in stock and cash, the culmination of 15 years building his business from a garage startup to a mid-market powerhouse. "This is what winning looks like, gentlemen," Adrian announced, raising his wine glass toward the assembled executives from Meridian Global, the investment bankers from J.P. Morgan who'd structured the transaction, and his own management team who'd worked themselves into exhaustion to make this moment happen. His words were slightly slurred. He'd been drinking since the pre-signing cocktail hour began at 6. Liana said nothing. She never did at these events. Adrian had made it clear years ago that her role was to look elegant, smile when appropriate, and let him handle the business conversations. She was perfectly fine with that arrangement. She had her own interests, her own investments, her own carefully constructed life that Adrian knew almost nothing about. "You know what the best part of success is?" Adrian continued, his voice growing louder, performing now for his audience. "You get to stop pretending. You get to stop acting like everyone's opinion matters. You get to finally be honest about who contributed to your success and who just existed alongside it." Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. Richard Castellan, CEO of Meridian Global, a silver-haired man in his 60s, glanced at his watch. The signing was supposed to have concluded 30 minutes ago. They had a celebration dinner planned at Castellan, the French restaurant on the top floor, where a private dining room waited with champagne already on ice. Adrian walked slowly around the table, his wine glass dangling from his fingers. He stopped behind Liana's chair. She could feel him there, could sense the restless energy radiating from him, the dangerous combination of alcohol and ego that had been building all evening. "My beautiful wife," he said, placing his free hand on her shoulder. His grip was slightly too tight. "Liana has been so supportive throughout this journey. Always there. Always present. In the room. Existing." A few nervous chuckles scattered through the crowd. Liana's expression didn't change. Her hands remained folded in her lap, her posture impeccable. "But let's be real," Adrian said, his voice dropping into a tone of mock confidentiality that still carried to every corner of the silent room. "She doesn't understand a single thing about what we do here. Mergers, acquisitions, market valuations, competitive positioning. It's all just noise to her. Isn't that right, sweetheart?" He didn't wait for an answer. In one swift, deliberate motion, Adrian tipped his wine glass forward, and the deep red Bordeaux poured over Liana's head. It soaked into her dark hair, ran down her face, stained her navy dress, and dripped onto the cream carpet beneath her chair. The $520 bottle, a 2015 Chateau Margaux that Richard Castellan had personally selected from the building's wine cellar, cascaded over her like she was nothing more than a prop in Adrian's performance. The room fell into absolute silence. Gas caught in throats. Someone's portfolio slipped from their hands and hit the table with a muted thud. Two junior executives looked away, their faces flushed with secondhand embarrassment. The lead banker from J.P. Morgan stared in open disbelief, his mouth slightly open. Liana still didn't move. Wine dripped from her chin onto her folded hands. She blinked once, slowly, as a droplet ran into her eye. Adrian laughed. It was a loud, self-satisfied sound that echoed off the glass walls. See? She just sits there, doesn't even react. That's my Liana, decorative but completely irrelevant to the actual business. He placed the empty wine glass on the table with a theatrical flourish and turned back to Richard Castellan, completely oblivious to the way every face in the room had transformed from celebration to horror. Now, where were we? I believe we have champagne waiting upstairs. Adrian Holt had no idea that in pouring that wine, he just triggered the collapse of everything he thought he'd built. The wine had stopped dripping by the time Adrian turned back to his deal partners, his hand already reaching for another glass from the server's tray. Liana sat perfectly still, her hands still folded in her lap, though now they rested in a small pool of red wine that had collected on her navy dress. A strand of hair, heavy with Bordeaux, clung to her cheek. She didn't brush it away. "Liana, sweetheart, you can go freshen up if you need to," Adrian called over his shoulder, not bothering to look at her. His attention was fixed on Richard Castellan, who stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "There's a bathroom down the hall. Take your time. We'll be celebrating for a while." The executives around the table had begun to shift, some attempting to resume conversations, others still staring at their documents, as if the pages contained an escape route from the awkwardness that had settled over the room like fog. A woman from Adrian's management team, someone Liana vaguely recognized from company holiday parties, offered a sympathetic smile before quickly looking away. Adrian raised his fresh glass of wine toward the ceiling. To Holt Innovations, to Meridian Global, to the future of integrated software solutions across 17 vertical markets. His voice boomed with artificial enthusiasm, trying to resurrect the celebration he'd just murdered. A few half-hearted cheers echoed back. Glasses clinked without conviction. Liana finally moved. She lifted one hand and wiped the wine from her cheek with her palm, then examined her stained fingers as if she'd never seen red wine before. Her face remained calm, neutral, almost curious. But behind her dark eyes, something had shifted. Something had locked into place with the finality of a vault door closing. This wasn't the first time Adrian had humiliated her. It was simply the first time he'd done it in front of witnesses who mattered. Her mind drifted back through a catalog of moments she'd filed away with careful precision. 3 years ago, at their home in Pacific Heights, when he'd screamed at her for speaking to his business partner about art collecting, calling her an embarrassment who couldn't understand real conversations. 2 years ago, when he told his golf buddies she was decorative but not particularly bright, while she stood 10 feet away at their country club's summer gala. 18 months ago, when he'd laughed at her suggestion to invest in a promising biotech startup, telling her to stick to shopping and leave the financial decisions to people with actual business degrees. She'd absorbed each insult, filed it away, and continued building something Adrian couldn't see because he'd never bothered to look. But this moment was different. This moment had crossed a line she'd drawn years ago, a boundary established during the last conversation she'd had with her father before cancer took him. Liana was 26 when Marcus Evans died in the private wing of Stanford Medical Center, his once powerful frame reduced to angles beneath white sheets. He'd built Evans Capital Management from nothing, turning a $50,000 inheritance into a private equity empire worth $4.7 billion. And in those final hours, with monitors beeping their countdown beside his bed, he'd held her hand and spoken with the clarity that sometimes comes when death removes all pretense. "You're smarter than your brothers, Liana. Sharper, more patient. But the world won't see that unless you make them see it." His grip had tightened despite his weakness. "I left you everything you need. The question is whether you'll have the courage to use it when the moment comes. And you'll know the moment when you see it. It'll be the moment when hiding becomes more painful than revealing." She'd promised him she would be ready. She'd promised him she would wait for the right moment, build her position quietly, and strike only when the impact would be absolute. 12 years of marriage to Adrian Holt had been preparation. 12 years of listening, learning, watching him conduct business while treating her like furniture. 12 years of being underestimated while she systematically constructed an empire he didn't know existed. The wine soaking through her dress felt like baptism. Liana stood slowly, the movement drawing a few glances from around the room. Wine dripped from the hem of her dress onto the cream carpet, leaving small dark circles at her feet. She reached for her small black clutch on the table, her movements deliberate, unhurried. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearest to her. "I need a moment." Adrian waved dismissively without turning around, deep in conversation with Richard Castellan about integration timelines and market synergies. Liana walked toward the door, her heels clicking against the marble floor near the entrance, each step measured and precise. But she didn't turn toward the bathroom. Instead, she stopped at the threshold, her hand resting on the chrome door handle, and looked back at the room one final time. The executives, the bankers, the lawyers, Adrian's entire management team. None of them knew they were looking at the woman who held the power to unravel everything they'd spent 6 months building. She smiled, just slightly, then stepped into the hallway. The door closed behind her with a whisper. Not leaving, preparing. The celebration had barely resumed its momentum when the double doors opened and Marcus Webb, Senior Vice President of Corporate Development for Meridian Global, stepped into the boardroom. His face carried the practiced neutrality of someone delivering news that would shift the entire atmosphere of a room. "Excuse me, everyone," Webb announced, his voice cutting through the scattered conversations. "I've just received word that the majority owner of Vantage Corp has arrived in the building and will be joining us momentarily to oversee the final signing." The effect was instantaneous. Executives who'd been leaning casually against the windows straightened immediately. The two investment bankers from J.P. Morgan exchanged quick glances and reached for their ties, tightening knots that had loosened over the past 3 hours. Richard Castellan set down his wine glass and buttoned his suit jacket, his silver hair catching the light as he turned toward the door. Adrian's eyes lit up with predatory interest. Vantage Corp was the silent third party in this acquisition, the private equity firm that held a 34% stake in Meridian Global and had final approval authority over any transaction exceeding $500 million. He'd never met anyone from Vantage Corp's leadership team. The firm operated with legendary discretion, communicating only through attorneys and proxy votes at board meetings. "Well, this is unexpected," Adrian said, moving toward the head of the table and adjusting his cobalt suit jacket. The wine had given him a flush across his cheeks, but his eyes were sharp with calculation. "I didn't realize Vantage Corp sent principals to these signings. Must be a very special deal." Around the room, junior executives had begun arranging chairs, clearing space near the entrance, creating an impromptu receiving line. Someone dimmed the overhead lights slightly, as if preparing for the arrival of visiting royalty. The energy had transformed from awkward celebration to anticipatory tension. "How much time do we have?" Richard Castellan asked Webb, his tone carrying the slight edge of a man who didn't enjoy surprises, even pleasant ones. "They're on their way up now," Webb replied. "Should be here within." The doors opened again. Liana stepped into the boardroom. She moved with the same measured grace she displayed when leaving 20 minutes earlier, her heels clicking against the marble with precise rhythm. The wine still stained her navy dress in dark patches from neckline to hem. Her hair, though she'd attempted to towel it dry in the hallway, remained damp and slightly disheveled. A faint red tinge colored the skin along her jawline where the Bordeaux had run down her neck. But her eyes had changed. The passive observation that had characterized her expression all evening had transformed into something sharper, more focused. She walked directly toward the head of the table, where Adrian stood, not looking at him or anyone else, her gaze fixed on the space she intended to occupy. Adrian's mouth opened slightly, confusion flickering across his face. "Liana, I thought you were." "Mrs. Evans," Marcus Webb said, his voice carrying a deference that hadn't been present moments before. He moved quickly to pull out the leather chair at the head of the table, the seat that had remained empty all evening, reserved by unspoken protocol for whoever held ultimate authority in the room. The title hung in the air like a thunderclap. Mrs. Evans. Not Mrs. Holt. Evans. Adrian's hand, which had been reaching for his wine glass, froze mid-motion. His eyes darted from Liana to Webb to Richard Castellan, searching for an explanation that his wine-soaked brain couldn't quite process. Around the room, executives who'd been smiling and chatting seconds earlier had gone completely still. The woman from J.P. Morgan who'd been checking her phone looked up slowly, her expression shifting from confusion to dawning comprehension. One of Adrian's management team members actually took a step backward, as if creating physical distance from whatever was about to unfold. Liana reached the head of the table and stood behind the chair Webb held for her, her hands resting lightly on the leather back. She didn't sit immediately. Instead, she let the silence build, let every person in the room complete their own journey from confusion to recognition to disbelief. Richard Castellan was the first to speak, his voice carrying a weight of realization. "You're Marcus Evans's daughter." It wasn't a question. "I am," Liana said simply. Her voice was steady, clear, completely devoid of emotion. "Vantage Corp has been under my operational control for the past 8 years, following my father's death. I hold 73% ownership through a family trust structure, with the remaining shares distributed among institutional partners who defer to my voting authority on all major decisions." She paused. Let that information settle like sediment in still water. "That makes me the majority shareholder in Meridian Global," she continued, "and by extension, the person with final approval authority over this $700 million acquisition of Holt Innovations." Her eyes finally moved to Adrian, who stood 3 feet away, his face drained of color, his mouth working soundlessly. "Hello, husband," Liana said quietly. "Shall we discuss the terms of your deal?" The room remained frozen in absolute silence as Liana Evans finally took her seat at the head of the table, wine-stained and utterly in control. Adrian's confidence didn't just shatter. It evaporated completely, like alcohol exposed to flame. Liana remained standing behind the chair at the head of the table, her wine-stained dress a stark contrast to the pristine leather and polished mahogany surrounding her. She placed her black clutch on the table with deliberate care, then rested both palms flat on the surface, leaning forward slightly as she addressed the room. "For those who don't know me, my name is Liana Evans. I am the daughter of Marcus Evans, founder of Evans Capital Management and the 52% majority owner of Vantage Corp, which holds controlling interest in Meridian Global." Her voice carried the practiced steadiness of someone who'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind. "I also hold final approval authority over any acquisition exceeding $500 million, which means this transaction requires my signature to proceed." The murmurs started immediately, executives leaning toward one another, whispered conversations creating a low buzz of disbelief. The woman from J.P. Morgan pulled out her tablet, fingers moving rapidly across the screen, presumably pulling up Vantage Corp's ownership structure to verify what seemed impossible. Richard Castellan had gone very still, his eyes moving from Liana to Adrian and back again, recalculating every assumption he'd made about this evening. Adrian's laugh came out strangled, artificial. "This is... Liana, what are you doing? This isn't funny." He looked around the room, searching for allies, for someone to share in his confusion. "She's obviously confused. Vantage Corp is owned by, I don't even know who, some consortium of investors. My wife doesn't, she isn't." "Your wife," Liana interrupted, her tone still calm, but carrying an edge now, like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath, has been the operational controller of a $4.7 billion private equity portfolio since her father's death 12 years ago. She reached in her clutch and withdrew a slim tablet, tapping the screen twice before setting it on the table where everyone could see. "My father established Vantage Corp 3 years before his death as a reorganization vehicle for his various holdings. When he died, ownership transferred to me through a sealed family trust structure specifically designed to maintain confidentiality. The terms of that trust included a comprehensive non-disclosure requirement that prevented public registration of the ownership change for a period of 10 years. Adrian's face had progressed from confusion to a sickly pale shade. That's not. You never said anything about. The confidentiality period ended 6 months ago, Liana continued, as if he hadn't spoken. At which point, I chose to maintain operational privacy while beginning the process of assuming a more public role in the companies under Vantage Corp's control. Meridian Global being the largest of those holdings. She tapped her tablet again, and the screen behind her, previously dark, illuminated with a document. Financial records, bank statements, transaction histories laid out in neat columns. What you're looking at, Liana said, turning slightly to gesture at the display, is an offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands under the name of a shell corporation called Holt Ventures LLC. The account was opened 14 months ago and currently holds $3.2 million, transferred systematically from Holt Innovations' operational funds through a series of consulting fees paid to non-existent vendors. Adrian's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. His hand reached for the table's edge, gripping it as if the room had begun to tilt. That's Adrian's account, Liana stated simply. Established without my knowledge, funded through corporate embezzlement, and structured specifically to hide assets during what I can only assume was preparation for divorce proceedings he hadn't yet initiated. The room had gone completely silent. Even the city sounds from beyond the windows seemed to have faded away. Richard Castellan's expression had transformed from confusion to cold fury. The J.P. Morgan bankers were staring at Adrian like he'd just announced he was carrying a highly contagious disease. Several of Adrian's own management team had taken steps backward, physically distancing themselves from their CEO. That's not all, Liana continued, swiping to the next screen. Here we have a series of emails between Adrian and his attorney, dated over the past 8 months, discussing strategies to remove my name from our jointly owned properties, the house in Pacific Heights, the vacation home in Lake Tahoe, and the investment property in Manhattan. The legal theory being pursued was that since I contributed nothing of financial value to the marriage, I should receive minimal settlement in any divorce proceedings. Adrian found his voice, though it came out as a hoarse whisper. You went through my private emails? That's illegal. That's a violation of. I went through emails sent from company servers at Holt Innovations. Liana corrected, her tone almost gentle now, like a teacher explaining something to a slow student. Emails discussing the embezzlement of corporate funds, which I became aware of 6 months ago when Vantage Corp's routine due diligence on potential acquisition targets flagged unusual financial patterns in your company's reporting. She swiped again. More emails appeared, these ones showing Adrian's messages to colleagues and friends. And here, Liana said, her voice finally carrying a hint of emotion. Not anger, but something colder, more final. We have Adrian's personal correspondence describing me as intellectually limited, decorative, but essentially useless, and this is my personal favorite, too stupid to understand that she married up. The emails were projected in high definition for everyone to read. Multiple messages, sent to different recipients, all carrying the same contemptuous tone toward the woman who now stood at the head of the table holding the power to destroy everything Adrian had built. Marcus Webb cleared his throat uncomfortably. One of the junior executives from Meridian Global had turned away entirely, staring out at the city lights as if desperately wishing to be anywhere else. Adrian's legs seemed to give out slightly. He sat down heavily in the nearest chair, no longer looking at anyone, his eyes fixed on the wine-stained carpet. Liana finally took her seat at the head of the table, crossing her legs carefully despite her ruined dress, her posture impeccable. Now, she said quietly, shall we discuss whether this acquisition moves forward? Adrian's hands came up in a gesture of surrender, or perhaps supplication, his palms facing Liana as if he could physically push back against the reality closing in around him. Liana, just wait a second. Let me explain. His voice cracked slightly on her name. I've been under enormous pressure. The stress of this deal, the negotiations, the late nights. I haven't been sleeping. I've been drinking too much, obviously, and I said things, did things that I don't even recognize as myself. He stood from the chair he'd collapsed into, taking a half step toward the head of the table. Two men in dark suits who'd been standing near the entrance shifted their positions almost imperceptibly, moving closer to the table's perimeter. Hotel security, Liana realized, though she hadn't noticed them enter. They must have arrived when she did, silent and professional. "This isn't who I am," Adrian continued, his words tumbling out faster now, desperation creeping into his tone like water seeping through cracks. "You know me, Liana. 12 years of marriage. You know the real me." It was a moment of stupidity. The wine, the pressure, the audience. I was performing, trying to be someone these people would respect, and I went too far. Way too far. I see that now. Richard Castellan remained motionless at his position halfway down the table, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But his eyes had gone cold, calculating. He was already running scenarios. Liana could tell, already determining how to extract Meridian Global from this situation with minimal damage. Adrian turned toward the assembled executives, his hands still raised, now addressing them directly. "Some of this is miscommunication. The offshore account that was set up by our CFO for legitimate tax planning purposes. The consulting fees were approved by our board for actual services rendered. If there's confusion about the documentation, that's on my finance team for not keeping me properly informed about the structural details." One of Adrian's own executives, a woman in her 50s who'd been with Holt Innovations since its founding, looked down at the table, her jaw tight. She knew exactly what Adrian was attempting, and the disgust on her face suggested she wanted no part of it. "In the emails," Adrian said, his voice taking on a pleading quality that made several people in the room visibly uncomfortable. Those were venting. Private frustrations that every person in a long marriage experiences. Taken out of context, sure, they sound bad. But everyone here has sent emails they regret. Everyone has said things in private they wouldn't want displayed on a screen in front of their colleagues. He turned back to Liana, taking another step forward. The security personnel moved again, this time positioning themselves clearly between Adrian and the head of the table. Adrian stopped immediately, his hands dropping slightly, awareness of a situation finally beginning to penetrate the panic. "Liana, please," he said, his voice dropping to something that might have been genuine emotion, though it was difficult to tell where performance ended and reality began. "I love you. You're my wife. We build a life together. I need you. This company needs you, needs us together. Whatever I did tonight, whatever stupid, thoughtless things I said or did, I can fix this. We can fix this." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the city beyond the windows seemed to hold its breath. Liana sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the table in front of her, her wine-stained dress a constant reminder of the humiliation Adrian had inflicted less than an hour ago. She looked at him with the same neutral expression she'd maintained throughout dinner parties and business events and 12 years of being treated as decorative background to his ambitions. It was the same silence Adrian had always mistaken for acquiescence, the same stillness he'd interpreted as emptiness, the same patient observation he'd assumed meant she had nothing valuable to contribute. He'd never understood that silence could be a choice, that stillness could be strategy. That observation was its own form of power. "Adrian," Liana said finally, her voice soft but carrying to every corner of the room. "You're right that marriages involve private frustrations, that people say things they don't mean, that stress manifests in ugly ways." Adrian's face brightened slightly, hope flickering across his features. "But you didn't just disrespect me," Liana continued, her tone unchanged, still calm, still measured. "You disrespected this company. You embezzled funds from your shareholders. You lied to your board about financial structures. You compromised the integrity of an acquisition that involves 4,000 employees across 17 divisions who trusted that their leadership was operating with basic ethical standards." She paused, let that sink in. "You poured wine on your wife's head in front of the people who were about to hand you $340 million, Liana said. "And you thought that demonstrated strength, leadership, authority." Around the table, heads began to nod. Small movements, almost imperceptible, but there. Richard Castellan, Marcus Webb, the senior banker from J.P. Morgan, even some of Adrian's own team. The board, such as it was in this moment, had reached consensus. So no, Adrian, Liana said quietly. You can't fix this. Adrian's face crumpled, all pretense of control, finally abandoning him completely. Liana reached for a leather folder that Marcus Webb had quietly placed beside her tablet moments earlier. She opened it with deliberate care, revealing a single-page document printed on Meridian Global letterhead. Her eyes scanned the text once, though she'd already reviewed it 3 times in the hallway before re-entering the boardroom. Effective immediately, Liana said, her voice carrying the formal weight of legal pronouncement. Adrian Holt is removed as a principal party to this acquisition agreement. Holt Innovations will proceed with the merger under emergency board governance, with operational control transferred to the existing C-suite pending appointment of interim leadership. Adrian's head snapped up. You can't. The contract has my name on every page. I'm a majority shareholder. You can't just remove me from my own companies. Your majority shareholding, Liana interrupted, still looking at the document rather than at him, is subject to the standard morality clause present in all acquisition agreements of this size. Section 14. Subsection C specifically states that any principal found to have engaged in financial misconduct, ethical violations, or behavior that materially damages the reputation of either party may be removed from the transaction with cause. She looked up now, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since sitting down. Embezzlement constitutes financial misconduct. The offshore accounts constitute ethical violations. And pouring wine over your wife's head in front of 180 witnesses, she paused, let the image hang in the air. That constitutes behavior that materially damages reputation. Richard Castellan cleared his throat. Additionally, Meridian Global will be launching an immediate internal investigation into all financial irregularities flagged during due diligence on Holt Innovations. This investigation will be conducted by external auditors from Deloitte and will have full access to all corporate records, email systems, and financial accounts dating back 5 years. Adrian's face had gone from pale to gray. An investigation? Richard, we've been negotiating this deal for 6 months. You've seen all our financials. Everything was approved by your team. Everything we were shown was approved. Marcus Webb corrected, his tone professional but cold. We're now discovering there may have been information withheld. That changes our risk assessment considerably. Liana signed the document in front of her with a pen Webb provided, her signature flowing across the bottom of the page in blue ink. She slid it across the table toward Richard Castellan, who signed it as well without hesitation. The J.P. Morgan bankers added their signatures. Adrian's CFO, after a moment of visible internal struggle, signed her name too. The acquisition would proceed. Holt Innovations would be absorbed into Meridian Global's portfolio. 4,000 employees would keep their jobs. The technology Adrian had spent 15 years developing would find its market. But Adrian Holt would not be part of it. Security will escort you from the building, Liana said quietly. Your personal effect from Holt Innovations offices will be packed and delivered to your residence within 72 hours. You're not to contact any current employees, attempt to access any company systems, or make any public statements about this transaction without approval from Meridian Global's legal team. The 2 security personnel in dark suits stepped forward, positioning themselves on either side of Adrian's chair. He looked at them, then at Liana, then around the room at faces that had been celebrating with him less than an hour ago. Every single person avoided his gaze. Liana, he started. Goodbye, Adrian, she said. He stood slowly, his cobalt suit suddenly looking too large on his frame, as if he'd physically diminished in the past 30 minutes. The security personnel didn't touch him. They didn't need to. He walked toward the double doors under his own power, his footsteps echoing against marble, while 18 corporate executives watched in complete silence. The doors closed behind him with a soft click. Liana waited 5 seconds, then continued as if there had been no interruption. The revised acquisition timeline has the deal closing in 45 days rather than the original 60, pending completion of the financial investigation. Are there any immediate concerns about that schedule? The meeting proceeded. By 6:30 the next morning, Adrian's phone had received 47 messages. By 8 o'clock, the number had climbed to over 200. Text messages from colleagues asking if the rumors were true. Calls from business reporters who'd somehow obtained his personal cell number. Emails from investors demanding explanations. The leak had been immediate and comprehensive. Someone in that boardroom, or perhaps multiple people, had shared what happened within hours of Adrian's departure. By the time the San Francisco Chronicle published its morning edition, the story was already trending on financial news sites. Tech CEO removed from $700 million deal after alleged misconduct, read the headline on Bloomberg. The article was light on details but heavy on implications, mentioning ethical violations, financial irregularities, and behavior unbecoming of executive leadership during a critical business transaction. By noon, Holt Innovation's board had issued a formal statement announcing Adrian's suspension pending investigation. By 2 o'clock, 3 of Adrian's personal investment partners had released statements distancing themselves from him, citing serious ethical concerns that require immediate clarification. The Century Club, where Adrian had maintained membership for 8 years, sent a brief letter requesting he not visit the premises until the investigation concluded. His standing tennis match at the Bay Club was canceled. The charity gala where he'd been scheduled as a keynote speaker next month sent a polite email suggesting they'd found an alternative presenter. Everything Adrian had spent 15 years building, the reputation, the relationships, the social capital, the respect of his peers, collapsed in less than 24 hours. And through it all, Liana Evans sat in her office in the financial district, wine-stained dress replaced by an impeccable gray suit, reviewing acquisition documents while the city hummed below her windows. 3 months after the signing that never was, Liana Evans stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office on the 52nd floor of the Meridian Tower, watching fog roll across the San Francisco Bay. Behind her, the morning executive committee meeting had just concluded, her fourth since assuming the role of acting chair of Meridian Global's board of directors. The transition had been seamless in ways that surprised even her. The same executives who'd watched wine drip from her hair now sought her counsel on market strategy, operational efficiency, and long-term positioning. Richard Castellan had personally recommended her appointment to the board, stating in his memo that Ms. Evans demonstrated the precise combination of patience, strategic thinking, and decisive action that this organization requires in its leadership. Respect, Liana had learned, wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned by showing people exactly who you were when the performance ended and reality began. She'd spent her first month conducting systematic reviews of every company in Vantage Corp's portfolio, meetings that often stretched past midnight as she absorbed operational details her father had managed through trusted deputies. The second month involved restructuring 3 underperforming divisions and identifying 2 acquisition targets that aligned with her vision for sustainable growth rather than quick returns. By the third month, Vantage Corp's portfolio companies had posted their strongest quarterly earnings in 5 years. The Financial Times ran a profile titled, "The Invisible Heiress Who Became Impossible to Ignore," detailing her methodical approach to private equity and her father's prescient decision to prepare her for leadership despite industry skepticism about dynastic succession. Marcus Evans would have been proud. She kept his photograph on her desk. Not the formal portrait from his office, but a candid shot from her childhood, him laughing at something she'd said, his hand resting on her shoulder. Every decision she made with his voice in her mind. Be patient until patience becomes weakness. Then be ruthless. The Holt Innovations integration had proceeded ahead of schedule. The technology was solid, the team talented, the market position strong. Everything Adrian had claimed credit for building had, in fact, been built by capable people he'd simply positioned himself in front of. Removing him had been like extracting a splinter, brief pain, then immediate relief and faster healing. Meanwhile, Adrian's world had continued its methodical collapse. The investigation uncovered $4.7 million in misappropriated funds, considerably more than the initial $3.2 million offshore account. The SEC had opened its own inquiry. Criminal charges were being discussed by the district attorney's office, though no decision had been announced. His attorney had negotiated the return of most assets in exchange for Adrian's cooperation with investigators. The house in Pacific Heights was in foreclosure. The Lake Tahoe property had been sold at auction. Adrian's social media accounts, once filled with photos from charity galas and business conferences, had gone silent 3 weeks ago. Liana had heard through the inevitable gossip networks that he was living in a rental apartment in Daly City, working as a consultant for a mid-tier software firm, his calls unreturned by the people who'd celebrated with him that night in the Castellan Tower boardroom. He'd finally learned what she'd always known, that respect built on arrogance was just scaffolding around emptiness, and when the scaffolding collapsed, there was nothing underneath to catch you. The magnitude of his mistake had been precise and mathematical. He'd publicly humiliated the one person who held his entire future in her hands, in front of the exact witnesses who would determine whether that future materialized or evaporated. And he'd done it while believing she was powerless to respond. That miscalculation had cost him everything. Liana turned from the window as her assistant knocked on the glass door, holding up a tablet to indicate her next meeting was ready. The Vantage Corp Quarterly Investment Committee, 47 portfolio companies represented, for $0.7 billion in assets under management. She straightened her suit jacket, charcoal gray, custom-tailored, purchased with her own money from accounts Adrian had never known existed, and walked toward the conference room with the same measured stride she'd used entering that boardroom 3 months ago. But this time, no wine stained her clothes. No insults echoed in her ears. No performance of subservience required. Just clarity, authority, purpose. And for the first time in 12 years of marriage, something she'd almost forgotten existed. Freedom. The kind of freedom that comes not from escaping something, but from finally revealing who you'd been all along. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt underestimated, dismissed, or made invisible by someone who should have seen your worth, don't keep it to yourself. Share this with someone who needs to remember that silence isn't weakness, patience isn't passivity, and the people who underestimate you often hold the keys to their own destruction. Like, comment, and follow for more stories about quiet power, strategic patience, and the beautiful justice that comes when people finally reveal who they've been all along. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic confrontation. It's simply letting someone discover, too late, exactly who they married.